Hello everybody. Welcome once again to another edition of Quick Trivia with Mike. It's that weekly game show right here on ECTV where we test your knowledge of recent and somewhat obscure history and facts. I'm your host and the Quizmaster, Mike Brever. Let's sit back and relax for the next half hour or so and have a little bit of fun, shall we? As you know, we always begin by giving you the 3 answers to the questions we posed on last week's show. Then we go off and we give you 3 new questions for you to do some research and hopefully get me some answers by noon on Monday. Let's get right at it, shall we? As you know, last week we talked a little bit about the history of voting in the United States. We're hosting this show today, a week after the presidential election, and we thought a little bit about presidential election trivia would be a lot of fun for you. As you know, we talked about the fact that in 1789, George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. But at that time, in order to be able to vote, you needed to be 21 years old, you needed to be white, you needed to be a landowner. Things changed over time. In the 1820s and 1830s, Andrew Jackson came up with the concept of universal suffrage, taking the landowner clause out of the ability to vote. Although you still needed to be white, you still needed to be 21 years of age. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment gave the right to all adults, regardless of race, creed, or culture, the right to vote. That was the 15th Amendment. The 19th Amendment in 1920, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. All women got the right to vote. The 26th Amendment in the 1960s, largely as a result of the Vietnam War and the draft that came in as a result of the war, changed the voting age from 21 to 18. After the 26th Amendment, anyone aged 18 years or older was eligible to vote. We asked you, as a result of that, and how it has expanded over time, what was the percentage of people, citizens of the United States, that actually were eligible to vote in that very first presidential election? We asked you to identify the number within plus or minus 3%. Well, the real answer was 6%. Only 6% of the population at that time qualified as 21 years of age or older, white, and a landowner. So although here we were a republic guaranteeing people the right to vote and choose their own governmental direction, really only 6% of the people were choosing that direction, and that changed over time till now everybody 18 and older is eligible to vote. So that was the answer, 6%, but we did say plus or minus 3, so I would have taken anything from 3% to 9%. That was question number 1. Question number 2. You know, I used to work at PBS and I have a real affinity for the Muppets. The Muppets, by the way, is actually a combination of 2 words, marionette and puppet. Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, actually came up with that term. He had created the Muppets in the late 1950s. You know, they really took off as a worldwide phenomenon in 1969 when Sesame Street started airing on PBS. But your question last week was, which was the first Muppet to appear as a regular on a national television show? The answer was Rolf. Rolf the dog. He appeared on a television show from 1963 to 1966. That television show, by the way, was the Jimmy Dean Show. Jimmy Dean was an American country music singer, a television host, actor, and businessman. He also was the creator of Jimmy Dean Sausages, as well as the spokesman for its television commercials. He became a national television personality starting in 1957. He rose to fame with his 1961 country music crossover hit, Big Bad John. That was a really popular song back when I was growing up. I just loved it, and it was a big Jimmy Dean hit, and it really put him on the map with music of both country music and pop all at the same time. That's what got him his television shows, and as we now know, Rolf was the first Muppet character to be a regular on a national television show. Incidentally, Jimmy Dean just passed away. I think it was in 1910. He passed away at the age of 81. He had an estimated net worth at the time of his death of $50 million. So being a big singer and a co-star with Rolf apparently paid off pretty well for Jimmy Dean. So that was question number 2. Question number 3, we went off a little bit on ballet. We talked about the different forms of ballet. We talked about the different styles, the costuming, how it is choreographed, and how it has evolved from its French origin into what we know it as today. But at the end of that indoctrination, if you will, to ballet, I asked you, what famous ballet star said, "No one should be called a defector. I'd like to be called a cultural exchange"? Who was it? What ballet star said, "No one should be called a defector. I'd like to be called a cultural exchange"? Well, the answer was Mikhail Baryshnikov. Mikhail Baryshnikov, born January 27th, 1948, is a Latvian-born Russian-American dancer, choreographer, and actor. He was the preeminent male classical dancer of the 1970s and 80s. He subsequently became a noted dance director. He also went off a little bit into TV. We all know that as a ballet star, you know, it's very hard on your body, what people in ballet are expected to do. And, you know, dancing into your 40s, you know, that's extending your career quite a bit. And Mikhail Baryshnikov went off and did other things like most ballet artists. He even had a recurring role in the last season of the television series Sex and the City. Mikhail Baryshnikov did, in fact, defect to Canada in 1974 because he thought there were more opportunities in the West for him to practice his art. And that's why he came up with the famous quote, "No one should be called a defector. I'd like to be called a cultural exchange." So there you have it. Those are the 3 answers to our big questions from last week. Rolf the dog was the first Muppet. 6% of the American population was eligible to vote in the election of 1789. And Mikhail Baryshnikov was the ballet artist who gave the famous quote about cultural exchange versus being a defector. Now, as you know, as always, if 2 or more people get the same number of questions correct, we do have a tiebreaker. And as a result of that, I sincerely hope you were listening to the bumper music at the beginning of today's show. I can tell you that Scott McFerrin is back from vacation, and as a result of that, this program is going to look a lot better as it is produced. He's just a lot better at it than I am. But be that as it may, listen to the bumper music at the beginning of the show, listen to the same music at the end of the show. If you can identify it, that's the tiebreaker, if 2 or more get the same number of questions correct. Last week, the tiebreaker was a really melodic number, almost a mournful number. And I told you that you could either give me the name of the music Or tell me the show that it was the theme music for. Well, it was called Ashokan Farewell. Ashokan Farewell was the theme music from last week. It was, in fact, the theme music for Ken Burns's documentary, The Civil War. Ken Burns's documentary premiered on September 23rd, 1990. It was a 9-part miniseries, and it dominated the ratings during that 9-episode airing. It actually aired originally from September 23rd to September 27th. They did 2 episodes a night during that period. It really put Ken Burns on the map, and I can tell you, it's what really made PBS a ratings concerned, if you will, television network. To this day, The Civil War is the highest rated PBS program based on Nielsen ratings of all time. I think it got about a 14 rating. I actually met Ken Burns several years ago. He's still extremely proud of the fact, his relationship with PBS, and the fact that he has the highest rated show of all time. Ironically, number 2 was a series that was on PBS when I was there. It was Downton Abbey. But Downton Abbey only had an 11. But an 11 in Nielsen ratings, nonetheless, is remarkable, given the fact that when Ken Burns did The Civil War, there only were really 4 major networks. There was ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. A couple of independent stations as well. But, today, you've got, 100, 200, 300 stations on cable television. And as a result of that, Nielsen ratings are interpreted a little bit differently today. But Ashokan Farewell, the Ken Burns documentary miniseries, The Civil War. That was the answer to identifying the music. We did have one winner. Nobody got the music correct. But Alex Hill is our winner for the week. Alex correctly identified Mikhail Baryshnikov and Rolf the Dog from the 1963 Jimmy Dean series. Alex also guessed 9% as the eligible population voting in the 1789 election. As I said, 6% plus or minus 3%. Alex Hill fell right in the middle there. So Alex Hill returns to the winner's circle after about a 3 or 4 week absence. Now that we're talking about winners, I do have an apology to make. On last week's show, you remember last week we gave the answers to the Halloween episodes from 2 weeks ago. And I identified Kelvin Schrader as the winner last week. And that's absolutely right. Kelvin Schrader was the winner. But Sandra Meyer got all of the questions correct as well. I've often told you, get your answers to me by noon on Monday by email, call my desk and leave a message, put the numbers on put the answers on a sheet of paper in my mailbox or slide them under my door. Sandra Meyer emailed them to me, and my oversight, she sent them in on Friday, and I didn't see it on Monday. My apologies to Sandra Meyer, a co-winner from last week along with Kelvin Schrader. So there you have it. That's our show from last week, the winners, and you now know who the tiebreaker was, Ashokan Farewell. And my apology to Sandra Meyer. Let's move on to this week's, shall we? Let's begin with a couple of interesting items here. George Clinton, Elbridge Gerry, Daniel Tompkins, Richard Mentor Johnson, George Dallas, William King, Schuyler Colfax, William Wheeler. All of you who recognize those names, raise your hand. Come on. Raise your hand if you recognize those names. I see a couple of hands raised, but I don't know. Believe it or not, those are all former vice presidents of the United States. Now that we've actually completed our election and we're beginning a transition phase into a new administration, I thought it would be kind of interesting to look at some of the things that are impacted by the election that took place last week, Tuesday. Thought we should take a look at the Vice Presidency of the United States. The Vice President of the United States is the second highest officer in the executive branch of the United States federal government, after the President, of course, and ranks first in the presidential line of succession. The Vice President is also an officer of the legislative branch, serving as President of the Senate. Kind of a ceremonial title, and the Vice President doesn't really do that very often anymore, except to break a tie. If there is a tie vote, the Vice President comes in and he breaks the tie. That's the only time the Vice President gets to do anything other than call meetings into order or adjourning the meetings. While the exact nature of the role varies with each administration, and of course the relationship that a Vice President has with the President, most modern Vice Presidents serve as a key presidential advisor, a governing partner, and a representative of the President. The Vice President is also a statutory member of the National Security Council. That was a new one on me. I didn't realize that there was a statutory requirement that the Vice President serve as a member of the National Security Council. Originally something of an afterthought, the Vice Presidency was considered an insignificant office for much of the nation's history, especially after the 12th Amendment, which meant that Vice Presidents were no longer the runners-up in the presidential election. Initially what happened was the top vote getter became President, the runner-up became Vice President. Now President and Vice President run on the same ticket. People know who will be Vice President, and that's who they're voting for at the time that they cast their ballot for President. So all of that changed with the 12th Amendment. The Vice President's role really began expanding in the 1930s when it was moved into the executive branch in 1939, and it has since grown even further. Due to its increase in power and prestige, the Vice President is now often considered to be a stepping stone to the presidency. In fact, many modern Vice Presidents have often previously served in Congress, either as a congressman or as a senator, and are often tasked with helping advance the administration's legislative priorities. I thought it would be really interesting to take a look at how many Vice Presidents became presidents. And that is your first question. How many Vice Presidents have become presidents of the United States? That's question number one. Question number two. We're going to go off a little bit now onto television trivia. You know, I really like to do this on an ongoing basis. I think some of these things are fascinating, especially given the fact that television really came of age during our lifetime. And as a result of that, a lot of these things that we talk about aren't just out of the history books, they're things that we remember. Here we go. There are four particular artists from television that I'm going to ask you about. First of all, Kenny Rogers. You all know Kenny Rogers, a wonderful, wonderful crossover artist, singer. He was known for country western, he was into pop. He was originally Kenny Rogers in the first edition, but he went off as a soloist. He did 65 albums during his career, sold 165 million records. Some of his most famous songs were The Gambler, Lady, Ruby Don't Take Your Love to Town, She Believes in Me, Coward of the County, Reuben James, and Lucille. Kenny Rogers, that is our first artist that we're taking a look at. Glen Campbell. Glen Campbell, our second artist. He also was a crossover. Started in country western, went over into pop a little bit. Glen Campbell did 70 albums, and those 70 albums sold 50 million copies. Some of his most famous songs were A Rhinestone Cowboy, The Wichita Lineman, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, Gentle on My Mind, Country Boy, Honey Come Back, and Southern Nights. Glen Campbell. All of those famous songs from him. I know you know Glen Campbell very well. Mason Williams is the third artist that we're taking a look at. Mason Williams probably wasn't as famous as Kenny Rogers and Glen Campbell, but is very famous in his own right. Classical Gas, the instrumental that you know from the 70s, that was his. Just a wonderful, wonderful classical guitarist. He was a composer, a singer, a songwriter, a comedian, and a poet. When I was looking up about Mason Williams, I found out that he did a rendition of Greensleeves that became a very big hit for him as well, right after Classical Gas came out. He also did A Major Thang, and he did Long Time Blues. Just some of the very, very popular songs that Mason Williams did. The fourth artist that we're going to take a look at was Steve Martin. Steve Martin, you all know, probably I actually know him most from his guest host stints on Saturday Night Live. But he also was a very, very famous comedian. He was a singer. He played the banjo really, really well. He's also a movie star. And he's probably best known as a movie star, in fact. Some of his more famous movies: Cheaper by the Dozen, Father of the Bride, Father of the Bride 2, The Pink Panther, Shop Girl, The Out-of-Towners, Three Amigos, all really, really wonderful, wonderful movies. A real comedic touch in all of them. Even in his music, probably the biggest hit he had in songs was King Tut, and of course the comedic touch in that was well known. It really, really highlighted that movie or that song quite a bit. So those are the four artists that we're looking at: Kenny Rogers, Glen Campbell, Mason Williams, and Steve Martin. There is something that ties these four artists, stars if you will, together at the beginning of their careers. What helped launch the career of these four artists? What do they have in common? Again, Kenny Rogers, Glen Campbell, Mason Williams, and Steve Martin. What do they have in common at the beginning of their careers that helped launch them as huge, huge stars? Our third question. Every time we have a change in administrations, which apparently we're engaged in right now, the budget and the debt of the United States of America becomes a huge issue. It becomes a political punching bag, if you will, that both sides tend to want to use against the other to try to garner the emotional support of the electorate. I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the historic perspective of the debt of the United States. Believe it or not, we talked earlier, one of our questions last week was about the very first presidential election in 1789. In 1790, the debt of the United States of America was $71 million. 13 colonies, $71 million. Of course, they borrowed a lot of money to start up the country, the Revolutionary War, etc. Country was very much in debt at that time. But by today's standards, $71 million wasn't much. The War of 1812, not long after, 22 years after that, took us over $100 million for the first time. In 1816, our debt was $127 million. After we won the War of 1812, there really weren't many things on the horizon. The country was expanding. It was gaining new wealth on an ongoing basis. And as a result of that, the national debt really started to dwindle. In 1835, the national debt was only $33,000. Essentially and fundamentally, that is the only time in our nation's history when we basically had no debt. $33,000 in 1835. Not long after the 1860s, the Civil War, the national debt ballooned again, and for the first time ever, in 1863, the debt went over $1 billion. It stood at $1.1 billion. World War I saw another tremendous expansion in the debt. In 1918, as World War I was coming to an end, but as we were starting to bear the brunt of our cost of engaging in the war, the debt went over $10 billion for the first time. In 1918, we had $14.5 billion as a national debt. In fact, the highest debt as a result of World War I occurred in 1920, $26 billion. Of course, the Great Depression, 1933 to 1937, we were engaged in a multitude of social programs. We were expanding on our infrastructure at that time, trying to get people back to work. The country borrowed a great deal of money to try to accomplish that. From 33 to 37, our debt really varied between $22.5 billion and $36.4 billion. However, on the horizon, right around the corner, 1943, $136 billion, and for the first time we went over $100 billion in debt. From 1945 to 1962, the end of the World War II era, the Korean War era, and we're starting to get into the Cold War era. Our debt ballooned, and it varied from between $258 billion to $300 billion. Starting to get into those numbers that are pretty hard to fathom. In 1972, largely as a result of the Vietnam War, our national debt was $398 billion. 1982, the Reagan tax cuts, and for the first time ever, our debt went over $1 trillion. 1982, $1.14 trillion. 2001 to 2007, we saw the war on terror. We also saw more tax cuts. The George W. Bush tax cuts this time. Our debt ballooned from $5.8 trillion to $9 trillion, and that led to 2008 when for the very first time our debt reached $10 trillion, and we were over $10 trillion for the very first time. In 2017, largely as a result of the Trump tax cuts, our debt went over $20 trillion for the very first time. Our debt reached $20 trillion in 2017. Now, I've made a couple of what you might think are editorial comments. Reagan tax cuts, Bush tax cuts affecting that. I'm giving you, what historians and economists say as the reason. I know there are political reasons and people have their own opinion about why these things happen, but that's the official rationale behind it. So there you have it. For regular voting taxpayers like you and me, we have a lot of difficulty really grasping the concept of our country being in debt over $20 trillion. We tend to think that people in Washington have lost touch with reality. They don't understand how people like you and I think anymore. We can't even fathom what these numbers are. And we think these people live in Never Never Land. In fact, truly characterizing this, there was a senator who said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. Now I know that anecdotally, that phrase existed for about 20 or 30 years before that senator said it. But a senator was the one who made that saying famous. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. Talking about perks in the budget that senators and congressmen put in and the president for their home districts. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon we're talking real money. Who said that? Who was the senator that made that statement that was so absurd that people think he just absolutely lost touch with reality? Those are your questions for today, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I thank you for taking the time and inviting me into your home. I hope you've had a great half an hour. I've enjoyed it very, very much. You can enter the winner circle this week by getting your answers to these 3 questions to me by noon on Monday. You can email me at mbeaver@eastcastleplace.com. You can phone me at 963-8425. You can write your answers on a sheet of paper and slide them under my office door, or you can put them in my mailbox behind the concierge desk. That's how you can enter the winner circle, just like Alex Hill this week, or Sandra Meyer or Kelvin Schrader last week. So hopefully you'll follow up, and maybe I'll be reading your name next week. Now, on behalf of the management of ECTV, our president Tyler Gudex, our executive producer Laura Wengler, my producer and cameraman Scott McFerrin, welcome back Scott, you were missed, and of course my artistic director Cooper Ledvina. Both Cooper and Scott really play a major role in the success of this show, helping me do research and suggesting ideas for me. So I'm very, very grateful to them. Once again, until next week, I do ask you all to please be safe, be smart, and be patient. We will all be together soon enough again to enjoy that wonderful East Castle Place hospitality. Until next week, I'm your host and the Quizmaster, Mike Brever. Thanks for tuning in. So long, everybody.